After years of being involved in investment banking hiring, let me tell you the brutal truth. Most candidates fail their interview in the first 10 minutes, and it's not because they went to the wrong school, or that they don't have the right experience on paper, or that they fail technical questions. It's because when they're asked to explain investment banking in 30 seconds, their mind blanks. Or when they're asked why this firm, they give an answer so vague that you know they skimmed the company website before they walked in. Or when they're faced with a question they don't know the answer to, instead of being honest, they just make it up on the spot, and you can see the panic in their eyes. And look, I get it. A high-pressure interview at an investment bank will make you feel like you need to know all the answers. But let me tell you something. Being the smartest person in the room is not what gets you hired. Those that get hired are the ones that can think clearly under pressure, explain complex ideas simply, and stay composed when things go wrong. So in this video, I'm going to break down the full investment banking interview system, the questions that determine outcomes, how to handle technicals without memorization, what actually happens on super days and assessment centers, and how to improve after every interview. This is the framework that I wish that I had, so let's get into it. Now, before we talk about interviews, we need to be clear on what investment banking is, because if you can't explain this in under 30 seconds, you're not going to survive the first question. So IB has two core functions. The first is raising capital for companies, both debt and equity, and the second is advising on M&A transactions, i.e. the buying and selling of companies. So at a high level, we help companies make major financial decisions and execute on them. Now, of course, that's just the central concept. You should understand more details about this, including what debt and equity actually are and how these capital raises happen, and alongside that, why M&A actually happens and how these acquisitions are actually funded. But fundamentally, this is crucial for the interview because you need to demonstrate that you know what you're signing up for. Now, moving on to interviews, and there are essentially two core testing lanes. The first is behavioral/fit, essentially who you are, why you're here, and why you belong. And the second one is technicals, i.e. how is your grasp of financial concepts and how do you think and explain under pressure. At Superday or assessment center level, there is a third layer, which is essentially your presence and stamina under volume. Now, before we break these down further, I want to introduce a core principle. Less is always more. Most candidates fail through over-explaining rather than under-preparing. So we always want to make 3 clear points structured well, and we need to make sure they land. Trying to say everything means saying nothing clearly. So let's now break down the behavioral/fit component of the interview, and we'll start with a common question, which is walk me through your CV. So here, there is a simple structure to follow. Your answer should be 60 to 90 seconds long, and it should start with present, recent, and then past. You do not want to start in chronological order from your first experience. You want to spend the most amount of time on your current experience and the least amount of time on your previous experiences. And this should mirror the way your CV is structured, i.e. your current/most recent experience should be the largest part of your CV, and then previous experiences should have 2 to 3 bullets each. And the premise here is that your most recent experience should be the most relevant. It should be the role where you assume the most ownership and show the most impact. And also it's the most recent case study that they have, so they're going to want to talk about this the most. In terms of what to emphasize in each role, focus on relevant and transferable skills and demonstrate ownership and impact. Don't just list responsibilities. So let's look at an example of this using the CV that I put up on screen. So this person currently works in transaction services and is targeting a LevFin analyst role. So they may say something like, I'm currently working in transaction services where I performed financial due diligence on 6 sponsor-backed transactions worth over $100 million with a particular focus on cash flow sensitivities and leverage considerations relevant to financing. Now pause here. This shows deal exposure, credit thinking, and execution under pressure, all of which are relevant to leverage finance. Now, given this person also interned in corporate finance prior to this, they can then say, before this, I interned in corporate finance where I built 3 statement models for 3 transactions, and I also analyzed cash flows and leverage sensitivities. So again, they're demonstrating a strong technical foundation and further deal context. And if they have time, they could even add a sentence to say, in an earlier sales role, I consistently hit 110 to 130% of my targets, which demonstrated drive, execution, and accountability. So you can see that most of the time is spent on the current role, and then they're drilled into the previous roles, and all of this can be said in around 60 seconds, and then you would hand the floor over to the interviewer to dig into this a touch deeper. Now, I kept that brief for demonstration purposes, but you may opt to drill in to your current experience a little bit more or showcase some achievements, because that can bring your experience to life and show further impact. Now, let's look at a few common mistakes, and the first one is starting with your education or the first role. As I said, you want to spend most of your time on your current experience and then some time on your previous experience. The second one is simply listing responsibilities. So in the same way we construct our CV, we want our explanation or our walkthrough to show ownership and impact. So things like analyzed, built, owned, etc. And the third one is not demonstrating relevance to IB. So just talking about irrelevant experience. Everything that you describe should have a thread leading to this moment. And you'll see from the example I described where we called out things that were relevant to leverage finance. So to summarize the thread running through our walkthrough, we start with where I am now and what I'm doing that's relevant, brief context from before, and then we can close with why IB makes sense next. Saying something like, given my exposure to transactions and my experience in financial modeling, investment banking makes sense next. Happy to dig into it. And assuming they bite, let's now have a look at how you answer why investment banking. And essentially, this is your personal story. So this question is not asking you what investment banking is, it's why it makes sense for you. And importantly, you should not mention money. This will kill your interview. So this needs to be centered on real work characteristics. So things like a steep learning curve, deal exposure or context, high stakes decisions, and impact on real outcomes. And you need to show evidence that you have validated and pursued that interest. So that can be through experience, projects, conversations, and then it should conclude with why investment banking now makes sense as the next step. And you should structure your answer using the OSAL framework, which stands for Open, Spark, Action, Acceleration, and Land. And I did a full video on this, which is linked in the description. Now, a few points on what would kill your answer here. So firstly, any generic prestige talk, so money, prestige, opportunities, that is not what they want to hear. Generic, I love finance and I've always loved finance is also not what they want to hear. And if you can't explain and demonstrate that you understand what bankers do day to day, that will also not look good. Okay, we've walked them through the CV and we've explained why investment banking. There's obviously a lot of firms, so why this firm? Let's look at how we answer that. Now here, interviewers want to see evidence of homework. So your answer should be specific, not generic. So you want to avoid statements like, your firm has a great culture, it's a market leader. They want to see that you've properly researched the company. Now there's lots of places you can actually do this research. So a few examples include company career pages. So look at the team structure, look at specific focus sectors and areas. And then you can look at recent deal announcements, league tables, press releases. You can also look on LinkedIn, follow the company page, and otherwise look at recent publications on particular industries where that bank may have been referenced. So the formula we want to follow has three components. The first is the firm's actual strength or focus area, and this should be specific and provable. Secondly, how this aligns with what you want. And thirdly, how you'd contribute based on your background or specifically what you want to develop there. Now, in terms of the type of research that actually matters, the first thing to look at is recent deals they've done in a particular sector. So not just any deal in any sector, a sector that is somewhat relevant or interesting to you. The second is team structure and coverage focus. So you want to demonstrate that you've done research on the actual team that you're applying to and you understand some of the dynamics there. Thirdly, training approach if it's publicly documented. So don't just make generic statements on this, but if there is public information that they put you through particular training and you like that, then you can reference this. And finally, culture signals from real sources, not just marketing. So what I mean by that is every company will say they have a great culture, but if you've spoken to people and they've spoken well of the culture, you can cite that in your example. What you don't want to say is you're a market leader because everyone says this, and that you have a great training program because everyone also says this. So these don't show real differentiation. And now let's look at an example. And you'll see here, it's not about doing hours of work. It's about finding 2 to 3 concrete examples that show you did your homework. So the example we'll look at is an M&A role at BNP Paribas. So a generic answer would be, I'm interested in BNP Paribas because you're a leading European bank with strong deal flow and global reach. This could honestly apply to any major bank, and there is no specific research evident in this answer. So now let's look at a specific example, and this can be said in around 60 to 90 seconds. Okay, so you may say, I'm particularly drawn to BNP Paribas' M&A advisory work, especially your focus on EV and energy transition financing, which connects directly to my chemistry background and interest in sustainable industries. That's a nice start, pretty specific to the M&A advisory work, plus we've linked it to our background. Then we say, I saw you advise Geely on the 7.4 billion euro horse powertrain joint venture with Renault in May 24. Which allowed both automakers to consolidate legacy combustion assets while pivoting towards electric vehicles. Very specific and a real deal example from May 24, which shows we've done our research and we've linked it to our interest in sustainable financing. We continue with, what stood out was the structure itself. The JV format gave both parties strategic flexibility during a volatile transition period, and then you facilitated Saudi Aramco joining months later as a strategic investor. So now we're speaking to details. We're showing that we've fully read this article. And by the way, both these articles are available on BNP's own website. So it's shown that you've gone through the archives a little bit, you've dug into it, and you've linked it to your background, your experience, your interests. That kind of advisory work, navigating complex stakeholder interests while supporting the shift to cleaner mobility, is exactly the type of deal making that matters for a more sustainable future. This is brilliant. I also noted BNP climbed from 12th to 5th in the EMEA M&A league tables in 2024, and you ranked first as EMEA loan bookrunner. That combination of strong advisory momentum and balance sheet firepower was further corroborated by Euromoney naming you, BNP, Europe's best investment bank for financing. Now we stepped away from that article on that EV financing and we've gone to league tables and we've called out some stats about how they're progressing up the rankings, showing their credibility. And again, we're linking this all together. We've done a couple, 2-3 bits of research. We've connected the dots here. And then we conclude with, this is exactly the platform where I want to further develop my skills in deal structuring, valuation, and capital allocation, particularly in sectors where financial execution and sustainability converge. Now, of course, the language here you may tweak. Of course, you can make it a little bit more conversational. But the point here is we did 2 to 3 bits of specific research. We linked it to our interests and we concluded with the fact that we wanted to further develop our skills in deal structuring, valuation, and capital allocation. And this is someone, as we previously referenced, who came from transaction services, so they do have some exposure to deal structuring, valuation, etc. But they're saying that they want to further develop that here. Now, I've linked the articles from which we found this information below, but in summary, we tied our personal interest, i.e. chemistry/sustainability, to a particular deal, and then tied it to momentum that BNP themselves are experiencing, and tied it to skills we want to develop, and this is a very credible answer to why this firm. Okay, let's now look at how we answer the question, why you? And this completes the trio of why questions, which are essentially why investment banking, why this firm, why you? And this question essentially tests self-awareness and relevance. So you're not listing everything you've ever done, you're mapping 2 to 3 clear strengths to what this job specifically requires. And there's a clear process you can follow for this. So the first step is to pull up the job description and extract the requirements, and then pick the 2 to 3 that you can clearly evidence, and these become the anchor for your answer. Step 2 is to state your strengths clearly. And here, be direct, not apologetic. You want to emphasize that you are the right person for this role. So you may say something like, there are 2 main reasons I'm a strong fit, or I bring 3 specific strengths that map clearly to this role. And step 3 is to back up each strength with evidence. So not feelings like I'm a hard worker or I'm detail oriented, but actual tangible evidence from your experience. Now let's look at an example, and this is again from our transaction services CV targeting leverage finance. So the first job requirement may be credit analysis and financial due diligence. And a good answer for this would be, first, I have direct experience in credit-focused financial analysis. I performed due diligence on 6 sponsor-backed transactions worth over $100 million where I analyzed historic financials, assessed earnings quality, and highlighted leverage considerations relevant to financing decisions. That work taught me how to evaluate borrower fundamentals quickly and communicate findings clearly to deal teams. This is a great answer, clearly addressing the job requirement with tangible evidence. The second job requirement may be working under tight deadlines with accuracy, and a good answer would be, second, I'm effective under time pressure without sacrificing accuracy. In transaction services, I supported due diligence engagements where we had 48 to 72 hours to analyze financials, identify issues, and prepare deliverables for management presentations that directly influence deal decisions. On one engagement, we identified a significant working capital issue 2 days before the client presentation. I rebuilt the analysis overnight, verified the findings with the senior manager, and prepared backup scenarios so we could defend our conclusions in real time. That experience taught me how to work fast without cutting corners, which is exactly what banking deadlines require. So here we can see beautifully mapped to the job requirement. We've actually called out a story of when we were put under specific pressure and how we handled it. And this is an example of a good behavioral answer. So to summarize the formula, firstly, state your strength, i.e. what you're good at. Secondly, state the evidence, i.e. what you did. And thirdly, connect to the role, i.e. why it matters here. Importantly, pick 2 to 3 strengths max. Don't just wheel off 5+ because it shows you can't prioritize. And here, the quality of your answer matters more than quantity. And secondly, stay factual, not emotional. So avoid statements like, I'm a hard worker, because it's vague, or I'm passionate about finance because you're not demonstrating evidence, or I have strong analytical skills without proving it. Now let's discuss behavioral questions. So beyond the 3 core why questions that we've just covered, you'll also be tested on 5 underlying qualities. So the first is judgment. This is how you think, prioritize, and decide with incomplete information. The second one is ownership, showing initiative, responsibility, or stepping in when you're required. Teamwork, i.e. collaboration and stakeholder management. Then fourthly, resilience, composure under pressure, recovery from setbacks. And finally, learning ability. This is self-awareness, taking feedback, and adaptation. Now, I want to emphasize something. There is often overlap between these, and you can often use stories to address multiple qualities or competencies, and we'll discuss that shortly. Now, the core principle here is you don't need 20 different stories to cover these. You just need 4 to 5 high quality stories that you can flex across questions. And the reason is that different questions often test the same signals. So let's look at an example of this. So if you're asked, tell me about a failure, this can test resilience or learning ability. And if you're asked, tell me about a difficult stakeholder, this can test teamwork or ownership. So it's up to you which of those characteristics you actually want to emphasize. Now, let me show you how one story can demonstrate multiple competencies. And we'll look at an example from a transaction services role that we actually referenced earlier. Okay, so the context was that during one due diligence engagement, we identified a significant working capital issue 48 hours before the management presentation. The client was relying on our analysis to decide whether to proceed with the deal. So there's the context. Action. I rebuilt the working capital analysis overnight to validate our findings, coordinated with the senior manager to ensure our conclusions were defensible, and then prepared backup slides showing different scenarios so we could answer questions in real time. So we've demonstrated what we did in response to that context. Now, moving on to outcome, the client used our analysis to renegotiate the purchase price. The deal closed successfully with adjusted terms. And I learned that when analysis reveals something uncomfortable, the answer isn't to soften it, it's to verify it quickly, communicate it clearly, and help the team respond. That changed how I approached any findings that might be contentious moving forward. So this changed our behavior long term as well. So we saw here that this person was faced with a difficult situation. They only had 48 hours before the management presentation. They took it upon themselves to rebuild the analysis. They coordinated with the senior manager to ensure the conclusions were defensible, and then they prepared some backups. And the outcome was that the client used the analysis to renegotiate the purchase price, and the deal closed successfully with adjusted terms. So some real impact there as well. And we learned that it's important to just confront things when they're uncomfortable. The answer is not to just avoid it or soften it, and to verify, communicate it, and help the team respond rather than cover it up essentially. Let's look at how this story flexes. If you're asked about resilience or dealing with pressure, you can emphasize the same story and say, I rebuilt the analysis overnight. It was tight deadlines and high stakes. If you're asked about learning and feedback, you can emphasize that you learned about communicating uncomfortable findings and how your approach changed to this moving forward. If you're asked about ownership, you can say you took the initiative to rebuild the analysis and coordinated the solution. So it's the same story, but different emphasis depending on what's being tested. So the key takeaway here is to build a small story bank covering these 5 characteristics, then flex them or emphasize differently depending on what you're asked. Now, if you're watching this thinking, I understand the concept, but when I'm actually asked the question, I freeze, you're not alone. Most people don't fail interviews because of intelligence. They fail because they can't structure answers under pressure. So they ramble through their resume, they try to cover everything instead of the 3 points that matter, and they never actually practice their story out loud. And I see this all the time with our students at Charter Mastery. So we spend most of our time making sure what they already know is interview proof and structuring and tightening their answers so they're fluent and can survive a tired MD at 4 p.m. Now, if any of this sounds familiar, there is a free strategy call linked below where we'll pinpoint where you're losing points and what to adjust first. Okay, with behaviorals behind us, let's move on to the technicals, and I want to reframe something straight away. In a technical interview, you're not being tested on your ability to memorize formulas. You're being tested on your ability to explain concepts simply under pressure. So structure matters more than completeness, and remember, if you can't explain something simply, then you don't understand it. So let's look at how we actually explain technical concepts, and here's the pattern that actually works. So firstly, we start top down, not bottom up. And this is a common mistake that people make. They dive straight into the detail. What we actually want to do is frame the concept, i.e. what it is, and then state our structure, i.e. these are the 3 main steps. And then we only go deeper if we're actually invited to. This is how bankers actually communicate, and let's look at it in the context of an example where we'll walk through a DCF. Okay, let's start with a bad example. And this is an example of jumping straight into the mechanics or the detail. So if asked to walk through a DCF, you say, so you start with EBITDA, then subtract taxes, add back depreciation, then adjust for working capital and CapEx, then you calculate WACC using cost of equity from CAPM, which is risk-free rate plus beta times market risk premium. Now this might be factually correct, but we've gone straight into the detail. There is no framing of the concept. There's no structure to our answer, and the interviewer has already lost what you're saying. So let's look at a good example next, and here you'll see this is so much better structured and clear. So at a high level, a DCF values a business on the present value of its future cash flows. I'd structure this in 3 steps. First, project free cash flow over a forecast period. Second, discount those cash flows using a rate that reflects risk. Third, add a terminal value to capture cash flows beyond the forecast. The key drivers are cash flow growth, margins, capital intensity, and the discount rate. Happy to go deeper into any specific step. Now this version is so much better. We led with the concept as to what a DCF actually is. We gave a clear structure, i.e. the 3 steps. We named the key drivers and we offered depth without actually forcing it. And then we've given the interviewer the opportunity to explore more. So the key principle here is that bankers think top down, not bottom up. So if you can think like that, then you will make a positive impression. So remember, structure first, detail second. Okay, let's now look at how you handle a question where you don't know the answer. And the reality here is not knowing the answer is actually okay, but how you handle it is what's important. So in terms of what works here, acknowledge the gap honestly. Don't try and blag your way out of it. Just own up to it and say, I'm actually not sure. But then the next step is to ask clarifying questions where appropriate. Of course, you don't want to ask too many, but 1 or 2 just to contextualize the situation for you. And then walk them through your reasoning process and how you actually think through the problem. Now, in terms of what doesn't work, as I just mentioned, don't bluff and try and make things up because they'll see straight through it. Also, freezing and just very, very long silences aren't great. So as I said, you have to get to a point where you have to get enough information to start reasoning through the process. Throughout this, don't over apologize. It's okay not to know things, just own it and then deal with it. Over apologizing shows that you don't feel like you belong in the room or you've essentially been overwhelmed by this situation, and that is not the outcome that you want. Okay, let's look at an example when you're faced with a question that you're genuinely unsure about. And as I said, it's not about faking an answer, it's about walking through your thinking. Okay, so let's say you were faced with a question, walk me through how you would value a company with no earnings and limited revenue. So a bad answer where you're bluffing would be, well, you'd still do a DCF, but adjust the, and then you look at comparable metrics and maybe use revenue multiples. It's vague, no structure, and you're clearly uncertain about where you're going. Let's look at a good example. And here you're being honest and showing structured thinking. So you begin by saying, I'm not certain, I've worked through this exact scenario before, but here's how I think about it. Without earnings or meaningful revenue, traditional DCF becomes unreliable. I'd likely rely more on relative valuation, looking at precedent transactions for similar early stage companies. The key would be identifying the right comparables, same sector, similar growth stage, comparable unit economics if available. I'd focus on forward-looking metrics, user growth, customer acquisition costs, lifetime value projections, and any valuation would be highly directional rather than precise. Is that the right framework, or would you approach it differently? Now, this is honestly an excellent answer. We've acknowledged uncertainty up front, so we're not bluffing, but we've still showed structured thinking. We've named the key considerations, as we said, comparables, forward metrics, and recognized the limitations that it's highly directional. And then we've invited correction and guidance, which shows that you can learn. But throughout this, we're still demonstrating understanding of the actual DCF, right? We called out, because there is limited revenue and cash flow information here, the DCF does not really work. So we've demonstrated we actually understand how DCFs work, and then we're going beyond that into a realm that we don't fully understand, but we're showing structured thinking here. So the key principle here is that interviewers actually expect gaps, especially when they throw you curveballs or edge cases. What they don't expect is bluffing and dishonesty. They want you to own it and be humble about it and show your structured thinking, your critical thinking. And if you can do that well and basically reason your way through ambiguity, you actually showcase yourself in a very positive light. Right, we've covered behaviorals and technicals. Let's look at some advanced execution strategies, and we'll begin with what to actually expect at super days and assessment centers. Now here you're going to have multiple interviews with people at varying seniority back to back, so the volume is going to be high. So it's going to be intense, and they're looking for a few different things. And the first one is consistency of answers across interviews, i.e. do you contradict yourself? The second one is composure under pressure and volume, because as I said, you're going to be having back-to-back conversations with different people, often with a short break in between. The third one is interpersonal maturity. As I said, you're going to have conversations with different people of varying seniority. So how do you interact with them? Do you hold your own regardless of who you're talking to? And finally, stamina. Can you maintain the quality throughout the day? So to succeed, you need to maintain energy across all interviews. You need to maintain a consistent narrative throughout the day, and you need to treat every single interaction as though you're being assessed, and that includes breaks and during lunch. Essentially, you need to be professional from arrival to departure, and here's some tips to navigate this. The first thing goes without saying, be well rested before you arrive. You'll inevitably be nervous, so your sleep quality will be poorer anyway. So get to sleep early. If you're having to travel for the super day or assessment center, travel the day before so you're not traveling super early and you're already exhausted before you arrive. The next thing is that you need to approach every conversation as though it's fresh. So you need to constantly reset, whether it's during breaks, lunches, or the next interview. You need to take a deep breath and remind yourself that this is one day that you have to endure. Yes, you might feel tired in moments, but you cannot let that get to you. You need to breathe deeply, reset mentally, get in the zone consistently, and just get through the day. Don't let any other intruding thoughts win. And finally, don't let tough interviews bleed into the next one. The day is structured to be grueling, but that doesn't mean you have to do exceedingly well in every single interview. They're considered as an aggregate on balance. So if you have a bad interview or you think you had a bad interview, no issue. Move on, wipe the slate clean, and do as well as you can in the next one. And I just wanted to talk about one of my experiences on my Superday / assessment center. So essentially, I had a particular interview / task where I was given 5 minutes to construct a plan of how we were going to execute a particular task. And I was given 2 pages of information and told to digest that information and come up with a solution. But I would be given additional information as those 5 minutes progresses via emails. And those emails were essentially somebody walking in and handing me a slip. And I was to incorporate that additional information too. So as I progressed, the speed of these new slips and this new information increased to the point where I couldn't even read those 2 pages because this person just kept coming to me and giving me new slips. And I got to a point where my brain was going to explode because I was like, I haven't even read these 2 pages, never mind all this new information. And I realized that this task was structured to essentially overwhelm me and see how I react. So of course that was uncomfortable, and I was just honest with him and said, look, I'm not going to be able to complete this task because there's too much information for me to get through. And that's actually what they wanted to see in terms of me just stepping up and saying, look, this is too much. Of course, at that time, I didn't know. I only got this feedback afterwards. So I walked out of that thinking I totally blundered there. But the truth is, you cannot let that get to you. I then went on to the next task and just tried to wipe my head clean and go with that. So as I said, it is intense. It's back to back, but do not let one bad interview bleed into another. Okay, let's now address questions that you should ask. And this is a super important part of the interview. Questions give you the opportunity to show genuine interest and maturity, demonstrate judgment, and also signal how you think. And you want to grasp this opportunity. And you do this through 2 to 5 thoughtful questions that build on what's already been discussed or are centered on work, team dynamics, and expectations. You do not want to ask 10 random questions. So let's look at some strong question patterns. And the first one is building on conversation. So say earlier on in the conversation, your interviewer mentioned execution risk. You might say, earlier you mentioned execution risk. How does the team usually manage that across live deals? So it shows you're attentive, you're listening, you're building in the conversation. And sometimes you can actually slot that in the conversation itself. So not all your questions have to be at the end of the interview. If there's a question that comes up naturally, turn it into a conversation. If you can get the interviewer talking, then you're not talking and you're using up interview time. Now, of course, you don't want to do this too much, but strategically asking 1 or 2 questions in the conversation can take some of the pressure off you and allow you to think and also make the other person like you because it turns into a conversation, not a monologue. The next one is role-specific judgment. Now here you might say, for someone joining at this level, what differentiates people who ramp up quickly? So this is a classic question of trying to understand expectations and getting them to articulate who they think is a good hire. And again, if this comes at the end, fine. But again, it might come in the conversation and you can obviously try and showcase some of those characteristics throughout. But of course, do this strategically. Finally, you might ask some macro or work-related questions, and this of course depends on what you're applying for, but some examples might be, how has the division's deal flow or client demand shifted since rate hikes began? Or rates have started to cut now, so you can say since rate cuts began. Or you might say, how have tariff wars impacted deal flow? Or what sectors are you most bullish on for M&A over the next 12 to 18 months? So of course, these are more specific to what you're applying to, and they are slightly more advanced, right? So you want to be careful that one, you've done enough research to understand what you're actually asking, you understand context, but beyond that, don't lead with these in early screening, right? These are definitely for later in the process when you've built rapport with your interviewer. So as I said, be careful with using these questions. Now, in terms of what doesn't work, we want to avoid generic questions. So what's a typical day like? This is so generic. What do you like about working here? It's lazy and it's kind of personal as well. What are the hours like? This shows wrong priorities. What's the pay like? You definitely don't want to ask that. And what training is provided? It's very passive, right? Like these questions everybody asks at every level, regardless of the job. So they show no perception and insight. Avoid these at all costs. Okay, so the key principles when it comes to questions are that you need to focus on quality over quantity and that they should feel earned, not prepared. So go with the flow and find natural opportunities to slot them in. Don't just wheel off some generic ones. Overall, they are an opportunity for you to showcase how you think. Okay, let's now look at the post-interview debrief system. And this is definitely an advanced strategy. You want to make improvements systematic, which means after every interview, you want to capture 3 things. Firstly, what worked, i.e. specific behaviors or answers that landed. Secondly, what didn't, specifically areas where you lost clarity or confidence. And thirdly, gaps that you identified. And this is essentially knowledge gaps or things that you just didn't know. And the reason this matters is because interviews are a pipeline, not one-off events. And conversion comes from iteration. Each interview should make the next interview easier. So the habit you want to develop is to log immediately because memory fades, and be specific. Don't just say it was good or bad. and then make sure you actually implement those learnings the next time you go into an interview. So some quick examples. So you might say stayed concise on resume walkthrough, which worked well, but struggled with why this firm, therefore need better research, and the technical DCF explanation was clear, so you can reuse that structure. Okay, we've covered a lot, so let's recap the entire system. So the first thing we need to do is understand what IB is, and we should be able to explain it in 30 seconds. The next is to lock down the behavioral core, which is the resume walkthrough, why IB and why the firm and why you. And then the third part is building a story bank with 4 to 5 examples that cover all 5 competencies. Then we want to master technical communication and focus on structure over memorization. Then when it comes to Superday execution, focus on presence, stamina, and consistency. And finally, we want to debrief and iterate, i.e. focus on systematic improvement. And throughout, focus on these 3 principles. Firstly, less is more. Focus on making 3 points, structured well, and ensure they land. Secondly, top-down thinking beats bottom-up, so remember structure over detail. And thirdly, clarity beats completeness. Remember, successful candidates aren't the ones that know the most, they're the ones that can communicate clearly, stay composed, and show that they can think, and that's what this system helps you do. Now you can watch every YouTube video on interview preparation and memorize every technical answer and still walk out with no offer, because knowing what to say and actually delivering it under pressure are 2 different things. And that's where most people get stuck. They understand the framework, they do the research, but when they're asked why this firm, they panic and over-explain, or they sound the same as everyone else. And that's what we solve inside Charter Mastery. We work one-to-one with students and convert their background into answers that hold up under pressure. Not generic templates. Your story structured clearly so you can deliver it even when you're nervous. We've helped students go from getting cut at the first round to landing multiple offers, and the difference wasn't their resume, it was how they communicated it. So if you're serious about getting into investment banking, book a free strategy call below. We'll identify where you're losing credibility and what needs to change. The link is in the description. Book the call and let's get you ready.